We're joined now by a big name in the industry. In fact, he was once known as the Sun King of Oil. He's written several books. His latest is called Make, Think, Imagine, Engineering the Future of Civilization. We're joined from New York by John Browne, former CEO of BP. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure.
So you left in 2007. You had a storied career. You oversaw the takeover of Amoco for $48 billion, Amoco, and you made BP a force in the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, you left 3 years before that deep water, that disastrous leak, the Deepwater Horizon. But tell us, just looking back on your career, what stands out for you when you were building BP into such a global force?
Well, I think it was a fortunate time. There was a lot of changes in politics, and technology, engineering improved hugely. So both those things enabled me to lead BP through a massive period of growth, exploring in the former Soviet Union, in the Gulf of Mexico, taking over Amoco, Arco, Weber, Castrol. There was a big list of things that we did. And to really put the company on the map as a force for change and hopefully a force for good. And of course, in '97, I decided we had to do something about climate change. So I made an extraordinary, at that time, statement to say, we're an oil company and we're responsible and we should take actions to reduce CO2 emissions. So that's what BP did, leading to a very different company.
Of course, the critics of the oil industry say that oil companies saying we're part of the solution is really just foxes creeping into the hen house, or arsonists saying we're going to put out the fire. Really, can any fossil fuel company say it's helping to fight global warming?
I think the word is help, not the total solution. There are 2 points I'd want to make. One is, we've got all the technology we need today, all the engineered processes to reduce carbon dioxide and methane emissions in the world. We just need to deploy them at scale. And to deploy them at scale, we need public policy to make it expensive enough to emit carbon so that people don't emit carbon. The oil companies need to deploy this activity. They need to develop it further, and they'll be part of the solution in that way. But they won't work unless public policy, that means the policy that you and I, everybody wants, says it's time to make a change. And we need to do this. We're wasting a lot of time. And as time goes, it's more and more difficult to prevent the worst ravages of climate change on the earth.
We should ask you about OPEC. We've heard some say that with the rise of American production, OPEC is a spent force when it comes to influencing the oil price. Do you think OPEC still has a powerful role in determining what we pay for crude?
Yes, I do. And the evidence is what they're doing at the moment. It's OPEC led by Saudi Arabia with Russia. And Saudi Arabia and Russia are two of the big three. America's the third one in the production of oil. And so it's in the vested interest, obviously, of Russia and Saudi Arabia to get the price of oil up. And actually, strangely, I think most studies now show that the US benefits from higher rather than lower oil prices. So everyone in some ways has a vested interest to keep prices up. And so that's what they are sort of doing.
I mean, maybe we'll put up a 10-year price for crude, but I mean, OPEC has been pretty disciplined about restricting production, and we haven't seen a surge in the oil price. I mean, doesn't that suggest their power has, in some senses, diminished?
Well, I don't think anybody really wants a surge in the oil price. The last time the oil price went up very high, all sorts of bad things happened. First of all, people spent far too much money in the oil industry and wasted an awful lot of it. I mean, they drilled it because it was there, as it were, rather than whether they needed it or not. So I think most people would say, and I would say, the price of oil has to be satisfactory to provide just the right amount of supply to the world and to make sure that stability is broadly kept in countries that really are very dependent on oil prices for their future. So that's in this sort of range, $60 to $70. That's not a forecast for the future. It's just a statement of, I think, what we've observed so far.
Now, as you know, we've seen quite a few companies retreating or leaving our own oil sands in Alberta, Conoco, Shell. BP has some assets, interest in 3 oil sands assets in northeastern Alberta, a partnership, for example, with Husky Energy. Although we don't hear that much about BP in the oil sands. What was your view of the oil sands when you were boss of the company?
Well, I have a long history in the oil sands and actually in ultra-heavy oil recovery. I was a very happy resident of Calgary, Alberta, in the late 70s and early 80s, leading a task force about whether we should continue work there. I concluded that actually it wasn't the right thing for BP at the time, and we reduced the amount of activity trying to get into more conventional activity. And certainly I maintained that position because I felt that we didn't actually have, certainly while I was CEO, anything special to offer other than money. And I think money by itself is not enough. You have to have a technique, a technology, an engineering idea to do something, and we didn't have that. So I think after I left, people went back into the oil sands. They're clearly sources of oil, but they are very carbon laden, and it's very important that the carbon dioxide related to this activity is somehow minimized and long term should be captured and stored or captured and used.
Do you think longer term Canada is going to have a problem because of the high carbon loading of the oil sands, attracting investment and even selling the product from the oil sands?
Well, I think certainly people are much more wary about carbon nowadays. Investors, big financial investors, very concerned to make sure that people have thought through what they're going to do with the product and whether it's actually saleable and whether people will reject it because they think it's damaging the environment. I think if oil companies actually really do something to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere, then I think they will be regarded as appropriate for the future. After all, the world will still need fossil fuel for quite a long time. It's 85% of the energy mix of the world, and that's not going to change too quickly. It will change. Obviously, coal will be reduced, and oil eventually will, demand for oil will probably flatten out. Gas will be very strong for some time, but it will be there. It's a very important source of our future. After all, it powers civilization.
You've been very gracious. You haven't tried to steer the conversation to your book, but let's look at it. Make, think, imagine. And you address this question of how technology has rebound effects. For example, the wonderful effect we can open our phones with our faces, face scans, also has implications for privacy. But you think that the drawbacks of technology can also be counteracted by human ingenuity.
That's correct. I think the answer to any engineering issue is this, that engineered products usually have a good intended consequence. There's also an unintended consequence, and that has to be managed through by more engineering and actually by public policy. You need rules and regulations to, insofar as possible, reduce the bad effects of engineering. But when you look at engineered products in the world, on balance, they've done extraordinary things. They've made us live longer, healthier lives. They've educated more people, connected more people, and actually made the world a less violent place. So there's a tremendous stack of things which are good, but there are some things that we need to watch. For example, I think a lot of people are given away privacy simply by looking on their phone and having the convenience of a service. When it says, do you agree, you press agree or consent, and you've just given away a lot of your data and information. We've given that away. It's tough to get it back, but nonetheless, in exchange, we've had a lot of convenience. Equally, we have drones. A lot of people worry about what to do with drones. Drones deliver medicine to villages who have problems or hurricane-stricken areas. Equally, they can be used for very bad devices to go and kill people. So that's something that needs to be managed with regulation, but also probably with this idea that if one person can do it, so someone else can. So while it's not called mutually assured destruction nowadays, I think it's mutually assured disturbance. If you have a drone which can kill me, I can probably control it to turn it round and do something to you, and vice versa.
I have to ask you this. You spend quite a bit of your time in Venice these days, so that sounds tough. Your book highlights Venice as it was a leading commercial centre. Technology played a role, shipping, glass. But I have to ask you, as a resident of Venice, are you exasperated by the tourists that come in every year?
No, I'm not. Look, I mean, you could be a pretty elitist here and say, you know, since I enjoy it, nobody else can. That's wrong. You know, the fact is that people want to go and discover and see places. We need to manage it. And actually, tourists, they tend to keep bankers' hours, if you will. They come in at 10:30 in the morning and leave at 6. And so they have a share and we have a share. And as a resident, a part resident, I say, yes, it's tough. But equally, I don't think I want to be somebody who says, no, you can't come and see it because it's mine, it's not yours. Venice does belong to the world. We need better management techniques to keep the flow of tourists appropriate and to repair the damage they do, because they're huge numbers of people. So probably they need to pay a bit of tax for that. They do need to pay tax for that. Otherwise, it's an unnecessary and large burden on the residents.
Lord Browne, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. John Browne.
It's a pleasure.
John Browne has been our guest, former CEO of BP and author with his latest book, Make, Think, Imagine, Engineering the Future of a Civilization.